The bank card they gave me had my own name printed on it, but it wasn't mine anymore. My son slid it across the kitchen table like he was doing me a favor and said, $75 every 2 weeks, Mom. That's more than enough for someone your age. I looked down at the card and my hands didn't move. And my husband didn't say a word at first. He just sat there, stirring his coffee, slow and quiet, like this was a normal Tuesday morning, like they weren't dividing up my life in front of me. And then he nodded and said, "Your son's right, Mia. You don't need much anymore. We'll handle the accounts from now on. Less stress for you." And that was the moment something inside my chest went cold, because less stress is what people say when they're taking something away from you and want you to thank them for it. And I remember staring at the tiny chip on the corner of the card and realizing this little piece of plastic was supposed to replace the entire life I had spent 41 years building for myself, working double shifts, sometimes staying late when everyone else went home, packing lunches, waking before sunrise, paying bills on time, saving every extra dollar because I believed security meant something. And now, security meant my own son deciding how much toothpaste I was allowed to buy, and my husband agreeing like this was sensible, like this was loving, like this was normal. And I told myself it was temporary because that's what you do when the people hurting you are the people you love. You build explanations for them. You soften their voices in your head. You turn control into concern and fear into protection. And that afternoon, when I tried to log into my online banking, the password didn't work. And I assumed I typed it wrong, but it didn't work the second time either, or the third. And when I asked my husband, he said, "Oh, we updated all that. Easier for us to manage everything together now." And he said it gently, like a nurse explaining medicine to a confused patient. And my son chimed in from the living room saying, "Yeah, Mom, it's safer this way. Too many scams these days." And I stood there holding my phone, feeling like I had somehow stepped out of my own life without noticing. And by the end of that week, my pension alert stopped showing up on my phone, my savings account disappeared from my login screen, and every purchase I made suddenly needed to be explained. And at first, the question sounded reasonable. "What do you need that for, Mom? Didn't we just buy groceries last week? Are you sure that's necessary?" And every time he asked it, my husband would sigh, like the problem wasn't the money, it was me. Like I was becoming difficult, like I was becoming forgetful, like I was becoming someone who needed supervision. And that word, supervision, never got said out loud, but it hung in the air anyway, heavy and constant. And I started noticing how often they spoke about me like I wasn't in the room. "Your mother gets confused sometimes," my husband would say, or "Mom forgets things," my son would add. And each time it happened, something inside me tried to protest, but the words never made it past my throat. Because when two people repeat the same story long enough, you start wondering if maybe they're right. Maybe you really are slipping. Maybe you really do need help. Maybe independence is just another word for stubborn. And the allowance became routine. $75 folded into an envelope every other Friday, placed on the counter like a chore chart reward. And if I needed more, there were questions and explanations and long pauses that made asking feel like begging. And slowly, the world outside the house began shrinking because coffee with friends cost money, birthday gifts cost money, and gas cost money. And even when something was technically affordable, it still required permission, and permission is a strange thing. Once you get used to asking for it, you start asking for everything. And once you start asking for everything, you eventually stop asking at all. And I stopped going out as much, and then I stopped calling people as much, and then I stopped mentioning invitations because it was easier than watching my husband's eyebrows tighten or hearing my son say, "Maybe another time, Mom, let's not waste money on that." And the house grew quieter, and my days grew smaller, and sometimes I would sit in the kitchen long after they left the room, staring at the walls, trying to remember when exactly my life stopped belonging to me. But control doesn't arrive all at once. It settles slowly, like dust on furniture you stop noticing, like a lock clicking softly on a door you didn't realize was closing. First, it was the money, then it was the groceries, then it was where I went, who I called, why I needed to leave, why I needed new shoes, why I needed anything at all. And my son started asking questions before I even opened my mouth. "What do you need it for, Mom? Didn't we already buy you something last month? You're forgetting things again." And every time he said it, my husband would make that tired, disappointed sound, like I was proving some private point they'd already agreed on. And the strangest part was how polite it all sounded. No shouting, no slammed doors, no threats. Just calm voices, reasonable tones, careful smiles, the kind that make you feel foolish for even thinking something might be wrong. Because abuse isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet enough to sound like love. And by the time I understood what was really happening, I was 68 years old, living in the home I helped pay for, asking permission to buy toothpaste. And the worst part wasn't the day they took my accounts. It wasn't the passwords or the envelopes or the quiet conversations that stopped when I entered the room. It was the morning I stood in the pharmacy holding my blood pressure prescription, counting the cash in my purse, realizing I could either buy my medication or eat that week. And I remember the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the pharmacist waiting politely, and the woman behind me shifting her weight, and I kept recounting the bills, hoping somehow the numbers would change. But numbers don't change just because you need them to. And for a second, I thought about putting the prescription back and pretending I didn't need it, because hunger feels immediate, but high blood pressure feels theoretical until it isn't. And my hands started shaking, and I hated that they were shaking because shaking hands makes people look weak, and I wasn't weak, I was just trapped. And that was the moment something inside me finally said the truth out loud, so clearly it almost sounded like someone else's voice. I wasn't being cared for, I was being managed. And if I didn't find a way out soon, my own family was going to control the rest of my life. And once that thought exists, you can't push it back into silence. Once you see the cage, you can't pretend the bars are decorations. And I walked out of that pharmacy with a small white bag in my hand and a feeling rowing in my chest that wasn't quite courage yet, but wasn't fear anymore either. It was something colder and steadier, like the first breath before a storm. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a question I hadn't dared to ask before. What if this isn't the rest of my life? What if somewhere out there is still a door they forgot to lock? And I didn't know it yet, but that question was the beginning of everything. I didn't leave the pharmacy that morning with a plan. I left with a prescription bag in one hand and a truth in my chest that wouldn't go back to sleep. All the way home, the pavement looked different, like the world had quietly shifted while I wasn't paying attention. Cars passed, people laughed outside the cafe on the corner, someone walked a dog that kept stopping to sniff every tree, and it struck me how normal everything looked, how the whole city kept moving while my life had been shrinking room by room, dollar by dollar, permission by permission. By the time I reached the front door of the house, my fingers hesitated on the handle, because for the first time in years, it didn't feel like walking into my home. It felt like walking into a place where I had to be careful again, where every receipt could be questioned, every minute accounted for, every breath monitored in that quiet, polite way they'd perfected. Inside, the television was already on, even though no one was watching it. My husband liked the noise, said it made the house feel active. I used to think it was just a habit, but now I understand it filled the silence, so no one had to notice how little we actually spoke anymore. I set the pharmacy bag on the counter, took out the bottle, and lined it up with the others in the cabinet, each orange container a small reminder that even my health had a price tag someone else controlled. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the shelf, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, feeling that steady, cold realization settling deeper. If nothing changed, this was it. This was the rest of my life, measured out in envelopes and explanations. And something inside me, something very old and very stubborn, refused to accept that ending. The idea didn't come as a full thought at first. It came as a question so small it almost felt harmless. What would it take to leave? I nearly laughed out loud when it crossed my mind, because the answer seemed obvious. Everything. Money I didn't have, accounts I couldn't access, documents locked somewhere that my husband controlled, a son who believed supervision was kindness, a house where even the mail passed through their hands before it ever reached mine. Leaving felt impossible in the same way flying felt impossible. Nice to imagine, but not something real people like me actually did at 68 years old with a blood pressure prescription and $75 to last 2 weeks. Still, once the question existed, it didn't go away. It followed me while I washed dishes. It followed me while I folded laundry. It followed me while I smiled through dinner and nodded at conversations about grocery prices and neighborhood gossip and whether the car needed servicing. And that night, lying in bed beside a man who hadn't kissed me goodnight in years, I realized the real danger wasn't that leaving was impossible. The real danger was that staying had quietly become unbearable. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual before either of them stirred. The house felt different at that hour, softer somehow, like the walls themselves relaxed when no one was watching anyone else. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and tried to think logically for the first time instead of emotionally. If I were someone else, I told myself, someone advising a woman in this situation, what would I say she needed first? The answer came immediately. Documents. Proof of who she is, proof of what she owns, proof of what she's entitled to. Without those, a person is just a story no one has to believe. My stomach tightened as soon as the thought formed, because I knew exactly where those things were. Locked in the metal file box in the bedroom closet. I'd seen my husband open it dozens of times over the years, always turning slightly away, like even the act of handling paperwork required privacy from me. For the rest of that day, I moved through the house like I always did, but inside my head, something had shifted into a quiet, watchful mode. I started noticing patterns. What time did my husband check the mail? What time does my son call in the evenings? On which days did the trash go out? When the house was empty and when it wasn't. It felt strange, studying my own life like a stranger gathering information, but the more I watched, the clearer something became. They weren't expecting resistance. They weren't watching for escape. Control had made them comfortable. Comfortable people get careless. 3 days later, the first opportunity appeared so ordinary I almost missed it. My husband announced he had a doctor's appointment across town. Routine blood work, nothing urgent, but the clinic always ran late. He complained about it through breakfast, about the parking, about the waiting room magazines, about how the whole thing would waste half his day. I nodded sympathetically, the way I always did, but inside, my pulse had started tapping faster. Half his day meant hours. Hours meant space. Space meant possibility. When the front door finally closed behind him and his car pulled away, the silence that followed felt louder than any noise the television had ever made. For a full minute, I didn't move, because this was the part where fear tries to convince you to stay exactly where you are. Nothing had happened yet. I could still pretend I hadn't thought about leaving. I could still make lunch, fold towels, and wait for the afternoon like every other day. Instead, I stood up so suddenly the chair legs scraped the tile, and the sound jolted me into motion. The bedroom closet smelled faintly of cedar and old fabric softener. Winter coats hung untouched, shoes lined the bottom shelf, and there, behind a stack of storage boxes, sat the metal file case exactly where I remembered. Seeing it up close made my throat tighten. It wasn't large, just a simple gray box with a small keyhole on the front. Amazing, I thought, how something so small could hold the legal outline of an entire life. I already knew the key wouldn't be inside the lock. My husband never left it there. For a moment, panic tried to surge again, because without that key, the whole plan ended before it started. But then another memory surfaced. Years ago, I'd once seen him reach up toward the top shelf before opening the box. Not inside the shelf, above it. My hands trembled as I reached upward, fingertips brushing dust, then cardboard, then something small taped to the back corner where no one would notice unless they knew to look. The key came loose with a soft ripping sound that felt impossibly loud in the quiet room. I froze, listening, heart hammering, half expecting the front door to burst open. Nothing happened. The house remained still. Slowly, carefully, I knelt, slid the key into the lock, and turned. The click sounded louder than it should have, but when the lid lifted, there they were. Birth certificates, marriage license, bank statements, insurance policies, pension documents, deeds, copies of tax returns going back years. My entire identity reduced to paper. For a second, the sheer weight of it all nearly made me close the box again, because touching those documents felt like crossing a line you can't uncross. This wasn't just thinking about leaving anymore. This was preparing to prove I existed outside their permission. My hands moved anyway. One by one, I pulled the papers out, stacking them in careful order the way I used to organize files back when I worked at the office, and people trusted me with responsibility instead of grocery receipts. I didn't take them. Taking them would be noticed. Instead, I slid my phone from my pocket and began photographing each page, holding the camera steady, checking every image twice to make sure names, numbers, and signatures were clear. The process took longer than I expected. My knees started to ache from crouching. Sweat prickled along my spine. Every passing car outside made my head snap toward the window, but I kept going. Page after page, proof after proof. Evidence that my life had legal shape beyond the kitchen walls they'd shrunk me into. By the time I locked the box again, retaped the key, and stepped back into the hallway, my hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the wall just to steady myself. Nothing looked different. The bed was still made, the hallway is still quiet, the clock is still ticking toward noon. Yet everything had changed, because now, for the first time, the idea of leaving wasn't just a question anymore. It was a possibility with documents attached. I walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and realized my reflection in the microwave door looked different somehow. Not younger, not braver, just awake. That afternoon, when my husband came home complaining about the clinic delays, I listened, nodded, reheated dinner, and answered every question the way I always did. If he noticed anything different, he didn't show it. And that was the moment I understood the most important rule of all. The safest escape is the one no one believes is happening. That night, while the television murmured and my husband dozed in his chair, I sat quietly with my phone in my lap, scrolling through the photographs of those documents again and again, memorizing what I had, what I still needed, and how very carefully the next steps would have to be. Because leaving wasn't going to be one dramatic moment. It was going to be 100 small, silent decisions stacked together until one day the door finally opened. And for the first time in years, instead of feeling trapped in that house, I felt something else entirely. I felt like I had just taken the first step out. If this story is touching you even a little, please take a second right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like Mia's matter because someone out there might be living this exact moment in silence, wondering if they're the only one. And if you believe no one should ever feel trapped in their own home, comment "You're not alone" below. Your words might be the one thing someone needs to see today. Now, thank you. Now let's continue. The strange thing about taking the first secret step is that the world doesn't change at all, yet inside you, everything rearranges itself inside. The next morning, I woke up with the same ceiling above me, the same refrigerator humming down the hall, the same quiet weight of the house pressing in from every direction. But now, there was a thin thread of purpose running underneath every ordinary moment. I wasn't just moving through the day anymore. I was measuring it and listening to it, watching for the small openings most people never notice because they aren't trying to disappear. For the next week, I didn't touch the file box again. One success was enough to prove I could act, but rushing would only make mistakes, and mistakes were the one thing I couldn't afford. Instead, I focused on something smaller and somehow more terrifying: money that only I could reach. Not the accounts, they were gone to me now, but actual physical cash, the kind that no password could lock and no one could freeze with a phone call. At first, the idea seemed almost ridiculous. How was I supposed to save anything when every dollar I received came folded inside that envelope they handed me like pocket money to a child? Still, once the thought settled in, it began working quietly in the back of my mind while I went through the motions of normal life. The opportunity came disguised as groceries. It always does, I suppose. Small, forgettable transactions no one thinks twice about. That Friday, when the envelope appeared on the counter with my $75 inside, my son barely looked up from his phone when he pushed it toward me. "Make it stretch this time, Mom," he said casually, like thrift was a personality flaw I kept failing to fix. My husband gave that same tired nod, the one that meant agreement without needing conversation. I smiled, the same careful smile I'd learned to wear, and said, "Of course, I always do." And I meant it, just not in the way they thought. At the store, I moved slowly through the aisles, doing what I always did, checking prices, comparing brands, calculating meals in my head. But this time, I added another calculation underneath the first. What was the absolute minimum I could spend today without raising suspicion at home? What items could be quietly reduced? What could be stretched another few days? By the time I reached the checkout, my heart was beating harder than it had any right to over something as simple as bread and canned soup. The total came in several dollars lower than usual. Not much, barely noticeable, but when the cashier handed me the change, I didn't put all of it back in my purse. 2 folded bills slipped into the small inner pocket of my coat instead, a pocket no one ever checked because I rarely even wore that coat indoors. The motion took less than a second. No alarms rang, no one shouted. The world kept spinning, yet that tiny secret weight against my side felt heavier than any purchase I'd made in years. From that day forward, the pattern repeated. $1 here, $3 there, coins sometimes, bills when I could manage it, always small enough that the grocery totals looked normal when my husband glanced at the receipts, always quiet enough that no one asked questions. I hid the money in different places at first. The lining of an old purse, inside a book I knew no one would open, beneath the folded fabric at the bottom of my sewing basket. But after a few nervous nights of imagining accidental discovery, I finally chose one spot and committed to it. At the back of the hall closet sat a dusty box filled with old instruction manuals for appliances we didn't even own anymore. No one had touched it in years. Inside one of those manuals, taped flat between 2 pages, the bills could lie perfectly invisible unless someone flipped directly to that exact spot. The first time I slid the folded money into that hiding place, my hands trembled so badly I had to sit down afterwards, breathing slowly, reminding myself this wasn't theft. This was survival. Days turned into another week, then another. The house remained the same on the surface. Breakfast conversations about the news, evenings filled with television noise. My son's occasional visits were full of polite questions that sounded like concern and felt like inspection. Yet underneath it all, something was quietly accumulating. Not just the small stack of hidden cash, though that mattered. It was the growing awareness that they didn't know everything, that their control, for all its tightness, wasn't absolute. That realization alone felt like oxygen returning to a room I hadn't realized was suffocating me. Still, money and documents weren't enough. Even I understood that. If I left, I would need somewhere to go, and that was the part my mind kept trying to avoid because it felt too large, too uncertain, too easy to fail. I had no close friends nearby anymore, not ones I could suddenly appear on the doorstep of with a suitcase and a story. Pride alone would have stopped me years ago, but now it wasn't pride, it was practicality. Showing up unannounced meant explanations, and explanations meant time, and time was exactly what I wouldn't have once the decision became real. The answer arrived in the most ordinary place possible, the public library. I hadn't been there in months. My husband said it was unnecessary when we already had books at home, and over time I'd stopped arguing. But that Tuesday morning, I mentioned casually that I needed to return an old novel before the late fees added up. He barely reacted, just waved a distracted hand and reminded me not to be long. My pulse quickened the entire walk there. Not because the library itself was forbidden, but because this was the first time I was stepping somewhere with a purpose they didn't know about. Inside, the air smelled like paper and carpet cleaner and something else I hadn't felt in a long time: privacy. People moved quietly between shelves, minds focused on their own worlds, no one watching mine. I wandered for several minutes just to study myself, pretending to browse, until I reached the back corner where the community bulletin board hung. I don't even know what instinct pulled me there. Maybe desperation, maybe hope. Maybe just the simple human urge to look for a door when you finally admit you need one. Flyers covered the corkboard in overlapping layers. Lost pets, tutoring services, church bake sales, yoga classes. But tucked between them, printed on plain white paper with simple black lettering, was something that made my breath catch. Women's Resource and Support Center, confidential assistance, financial guidance, housing referrals. Walk-ins welcome. No dramatic colors, no emotional slogans, just a phone number, an address, and the word confidential. My fingers hovered over the little tear-off tabs at the bottom for a long time before I finally pulled one free. The paper felt absurdly small in my hand, yet somehow heavier than any document I'd photographed weeks earlier. I slipped it into my purse, closed it carefully, and stood there pretending to read another flyer while my heart pounded loud enough that I was sure someone would hear it echo through the shelves. I didn't call that day, or the next. Courage, I was learning, isn't one big, heroic moment. It's a series of smaller decisions that slowly become harder to undo. The number stayed in my purse, then later under my pillow at night, then finally tucked inside the same manual where the hidden cash was growing, bill by bill. Knowing it existed changed something fundamental. For the first time, the idea of leaving included an actual destination beyond the vague, impossible word elsewhere. That Friday evening, while my husband watched television and my son argued with someone on speakerphone about car repairs, I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing dishes and realized the fear inside me had changed shape. It was still there, still heavy, still real, but now it sat beside something else, something steadier, a quiet building certainty that the life they had planned for me wasn't the only one still available. I dried my hands slowly, listening to their voices drift in from the living room, and understood with a clarity that almost felt calm. They still believed I was exactly where they left me, dependent, managed, predictable. And that, more than anything, was about to become their biggest mistake. For 3 nights after I took the number from the library, I didn't sleep properly. It wasn't fear exactly, not the sharp kind that makes you freeze, but a restless awareness that something irreversible was waiting on the other side of a very small decision. The scrap of paper with the support center's number stayed hidden inside the appliance manual with the folded bills, and somehow just knowing it existed made the house feel different, like I was already halfway out the door while still setting the dinner table and answering the same familiar questions about what I'd spend, where I'd gone, why the milk cost more this week. I moved through those conversations carefully, keeping my voice steady, reminding myself that the safest plan is the one that looks exactly like routine. Still, every time my husband glanced toward my purse or my son asked casually what I'd been doing all afternoon, a thin line of cold ran down my spine, because secrets, once you start carrying them, feel louder than anything you say out loud. By the 4th morning, the silence of not calling felt worse than the risk of calling. I understood something simple then. Waiting doesn't make danger smaller, it only makes courage harder. That realization followed me through breakfast, through the slow washing of dishes, through the familiar sound of my husband settling into his chair with the television remote. Around mid-morning, he announced he was heading to the hardware store for a part he had been talking about all week, something about the kitchen faucet making a noise. He said it would probably take a while because he wanted to compare prices at two places. I nodded the way I always did, but inside, my pulse had already started counting the minutes before the front door closed. When his car finally backed out of the driveway, I didn't move immediately. I forced myself to wait, to breathe, to listen until the sound of the engine faded completely. Rushing creates mistakes. Mistakes create questions. Only when the house settled into that deep, hollow quiet did I walk to the hall closet, slide the dusty box forward, open the manual, and take out both the hidden cash and the small paper with the number. My hands felt strangely steady now, like some deeper part of me had already accepted that this call was happening whether I was ready or not. I didn't use the house phone. That much was obvious. Instead, I took my purse, stepped outside, locked the door behind me, and walked 2 blocks to the small park where parents usually brought toddlers in the afternoons. At that hour, it was nearly empty except for one man reading a newspaper on a bench far across the grass. I chose the bench closest to the walking path so it would look like I was simply resting, sat down, and stared at the number on the paper for a long time before dialing. The phone rang twice. A woman's voice answered, calm, professional, not rushed. Women's Resource Center. How can I help you today? For a second, I sighed almost fully. My throat closed completely. All the sentences I'd practiced in my head vanished. The only thing that came out was the truth, small and fragile and almost embarrassed. I'm not sure where to start. There was no impatience in her reply, only something warm and steady. That's all right. Start anywhere you can. I swallowed, looked down at my hands, and said the words that made everything real. My name is Mia. I think my family controls my money, and I don't know how to leave. She didn't sound shocked. She didn't interrupt. She didn't question whether I was exaggerating. She simply said, "Okay, Mia, I'm glad you called." And somehow, those 4 words hit harder than anything else, because they meant I wasn't crazy, I wasn't dramatic, and I wasn't the first person who'd ever said this sentence into a phone with shaking hands on a quiet park bench. She asked gentle, practical questions. Was I safe right now? Did anyone monitor my calls? Did I have access to identification? Somewhere to go for at least one night if necessary? Each answer felt like laying another piece of my life on the table for inspection, yet instead of feeling exposed, I felt organized. For the first time, someone was helping me turn panic into steps. Her name was Carla, and by the end of that call, she had done something astonishingly simple. She gave me a plan for the next 48 hours, not the entire escape, not some dramatic overnight rescue, just the next 2 days. Step 1. Keep gathering small cash the way I already had been. Step 2, make a written list of every document I'd photographed so nothing would be forgotten later. Step 3, come to the center in person if I could do so safely, because they could connect me with legal advice and temporary housing options I wouldn't find alone. You don't have to decide everything today, she told me quietly. You only have to keep moving one step at a time. When the call ended, I realized my hands had stopped shaking entirely. The park looked the same, the distant man still turning newspaper pages, a breeze moving the leaves exactly as before, yet something fundamental had shifted. Before, leaving had been an idea I carried alone. Now, another human was in the world who knew my name and knew I was trying. That alone made the path feel real. The walk home felt longer, but not heavier. Inside, the house greeted me with the same familiar stillness, the same ticking clock, the same faint smell of coffee grounds in the trash. I returned the paper and the cash to their hiding place, slid the box back exactly as it had been, and went to start lunch just minutes before my husband returned with a plastic bag of plumbing parts and a story about how overpriced everything had become. I listened, nodded, asked the right small questions, and for the first time, I understood something crucial. Secrecy isn't just about hiding actions, it's about performing normal so convincingly no one thinks to look underneath. Over the next week, Carla's instructions followed almost obsessive care. At night, after everyone slept, I wrote the document list slowly on a torn piece of notebook paper, checking each photographed item against memory until the list felt complete. During grocery trips, the hidden money grew thicker by a few bills at a time, and twice, under perfectly ordinary excuses, I walked past the Resource Center building just to see it with my own eyes. A small brick office between a dentist and an insurance agency. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would ever attract attention. Exactly the kind of place someone could enter without the world noticing. The actual visit happened on a Wednesday morning when my son called to say he wouldn't be stopping by that week, and my husband mentioned a long card game with friends across town. The timing lined up so perfectly it almost felt staged, though I knew better than to trust luck. I dressed the same way I always did for errands, took my usual purse, and told my husband I needed to return a book and pick up a few groceries. He barely looked up, just reminded me not to overspend. My heart hammered the entire bus ride across town, but once I stepped through the glass door of that small office, the sound of it closing behind me felt like the loudest, most hopeful click I'd heard in years. Carla turned out to be younger than I expected, maybe mid-40s, with tired eyes but a voice that never rushed. She didn't treat me like a victim, she treated me like a person, making a logistical transition. We sat in a modest office with a desk, 2 chairs, and a small window facing a parking lot, and for nearly an hour we talked, not just about what had been happening, but about what leaving would practically require. Safe mailing address, emergency transportation, legal consultation about marital assets, short-term housing where no one could simply walk in and demand I return. Each item sounded overwhelming alone, yet when she listed the resources already available, the impossibility I'd believed in for years began shrinking into something measurable. Before I left, she handed me a small prepaid flip phone, still sealed in its plastic packaging. "Keep this hidden," she said gently. "Only use it for calls related to your plan. If anyone finds your regular phone, they won't find this." I stared at that tiny box for a long moment because it wasn't just a phone. It was a line of communication they didn't control, a voice that could exist outside their hearing. I slipped it into the bottom of my purse, beneath the grocery list, thanked her, and walked back out into the ordinary daylight, feeling like I was carrying something far more dangerous than electronics. That night, lying in bed beside my husband's steady breathing, I understood with a calm certainty that hadn't existed before. This was no longer a question of whether I could leave, it was only a question of when. And somewhere deep inside, for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a locked room anymore. After the day Carla handed me the small prepaid phone, time started moving in 2 completely different speeds at once. On the outside, nothing changed. Breakfast still happened at the same hour. The television filled the afternoons with the same endless noise. My husband still asked what things cost, still frowned at receipts, still spoke about keeping everything organized like it was a kindness. My son still called with that careful, patient voice that sounded helpful to anyone listening and suffocating to the person it was aimed at. But underneath that familiar rhythm, something else had begun ticking quietly forward, like a second clock only I could hear. I kept the phone hidden exactly the way Carla told me, wrapped in an old scarf at the very bottom of the sewing basket where no one ever bothered looking. The first time I turned it on late at night, watching the small screen glow faintly in the dark kitchen, I felt a strange, almost guilty relief. It wasn't the technology, it was what it represented. A connection they didn't authorize, a voice outside their hearing, a proof that the world beyond that house still existed and could still answer when I called. The plan itself didn't form all at once. It grew the way everything in this escape had grown, quietly, piece by piece until one day it wasn't an idea anymore, but a timeline. Carla helped me build it slowly during 2 short meetings spaced a week apart. Not dramatic conversations, practical ones. We talked about transportation first, because leaving without a guaranteed ride was the fastest way to end up forced back. Then we talked about where I would sleep the first night, and the second, and the third, because safety isn't just the moment you walk out the door, it's the days after when people start looking for you. She connected me with a transitional residence across town, a small shared building run by a woman named Denise who specialized in quiet arrivals and confidential stays. I wouldn't need much money up front, just enough for the first week while legal paperwork began. When Carla said, "We can reserve a room as soon as you choose a date," the reality of it landed so heavily in my chest, I had to grip the arm of the chair just to steady myself. Choosing the date turned out to be the hardest part of all, not because there weren't opportunities, but because picking a day meant accepting that the life I'd been living for decades would officially end at a specific hour on a specific morning. For several nights, I lay awake listening to my husband's breathing beside me, staring into the dark, wondering how something could feel both terrifying and completely inevitable at the same time. In the end, the answer came from the same place the earlier opportunities had come from: routine. My husband had a full physical scheduled, 3 Wednesdays from then, the kind with lab work and imaging that always kept him gone half the day. My son, I knew from one of his casual phone conversations, would be traveling for work that same week. The overlap created a window so clean it almost felt like permission. Once the date existed, everything sharpened. The suitcase came first. Not a large one, Carla had been very clear about that. "Take what you truly need, not what you feel guilty leaving," she had said. I found an old, medium-sized roller bag buried in the back of the storage closet, the same one we hadn't used since a family trip years earlier. Getting it into my bedroom without question required patience. I waited for laundry day when moving bulky items around the house looked normal, and carried it upstairs folded beneath a stack of towels. For 2 days, it sat empty behind the hanging coats while I adjusted to the sight of it, because even an empty suitcase can feel like a declaration. Packing happened slowly, over nearly 2 weeks, 1 item at a time, so nothing would be noticed missing. A pair of comfortable shoes slipped in beneath winter scarves, 2 blouses folded between old cardigans, important photographs tucked flat into the inside pocket, my medication placed carefully inside a small toiletry pouch I could reach quickly. Each addition made the reality more solid, more irreversible, yet strangely calmer too, like I wasn't running anymore, just preparing. The hidden cash grew thicker, not enough to start a new life outright, but enough to breathe for a few days without asking anyone for permission. The document photos stayed backed up inside the prepaid phone, the way Carla showed me, along with the emergency contact numbers for the residence, the legal clinic, and a taxi service that accepted cash. Each small preparation removed one more unknown, and with each unknown gone, the fear changed shape again. It wasn't the paralyzing fear of "what if I can't?" It was the focused awareness of "I must not make mistakes now." The final week felt almost unreal. My husband complained about the faucet again, the television showed politics, the grocery list stayed predictable. My son called once to remind me to stay careful with spending, and I answered with the same soft reassurance I'd always used. Inside, though, I was counting days like someone counts down to surgery, knowing it has to happen, knowing delay only prolongs the pain. The night before the chosen Wednesday, I barely slept at all. Not from panic, from a deep, vibrating alertness, like every sense in my body understood that by this time tomorrow, nothing would be the same. I lay there listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the creak of the hallway floorboards, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the faint rattle of wind against the kitchen vent, and instead of feeling trapped by them, I found myself memorizing them. Not out of nostalgia, out of closure. This was the last night those sounds would belong to my daily life. Morning arrived almost gently. I moved through the routine exactly as always. Coffee brewed, eggs scrambled, toast browned. My husband read the news aloud in irritated fragments, while I answered with the same small responses I'd practiced for years. If he sensed anything different, he didn't show it. When he finally stood, grabbed his keys, and reminded me he'd be gone most of the morning, I handed him his travel mug and told him to drive safely. The front door closed, his footsteps faded, the car engine started, then disappeared down the street. I waited 10 full minutes, not pacing, not rushing, just standing at the kitchen counter with my palms flat against the surface, breathing slowly, listening until the silence felt absolute. Only then did I walk upstairs, open the closet, and pull the suitcase forward into the open room. For a moment, I simply looked at it. This bag held the entire future I was choosing. My hands didn't tremble when I zipped it shut. That surprised me most of all. After months of fear, months of planning, months of imagining this exact second, the feeling that settled over me wasn't panic. It was clarity. I took one last slow walk through the house, not touching anything, not lingering, just seeing it plainly. The kitchen where every dollar had been questioned, the living room where every decision had been discussed without me, the hallway where I'd learned to move quietly so no one would ask what I was doing. For the first time, none of it felt like mine, and because it didn't feel like mine, leaving it behind suddenly felt simple. Outside, the taxi Carla arranged was already waiting at the curb, engine running softly. The driver stepped out, opened the trunk without asking questions, and placed the suitcase inside as if this were the most ordinary pickup in the world. I slid into the back seat, closed the door, and felt the smallest, strangest wave of disbelief pass through me as the car pulled away from the curb. No one shouted, no one stopped us, no one even knew. As the house shrank smaller in the rearview window, I expected some rush of grief or anger or second-guessing. Instead, what filled my chest was something lighter and steadier than anything I'd felt in years. Relief. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, undeniable relief, like finally setting down a weight you'd carried so long you forgot what standing straight felt like. And as the car turned the corner and the house disappeared completely, I understood with absolute certainty that this wasn't the end of something. It was the first real beginning I'd had in decades. The moment the taxi pulled away from the curb, I thought the hardest part would be over. For months, I had imagined that leaving the house would feel like crossing some invisible finish line, that once the door closed behind me and the street carried me forward, everything inside my chest would finally settle. But the truth was stranger than that. The first 20 minutes of that drive felt almost unreal, like I was watching someone else's life happen through the window while the city moved past in ordinary fragments, traffic lights, storefronts, a woman dragging grocery bags across the crosswalk, a man jogging with headphones, a school bus sighing to a stop. Everything looked so painfully normal that part of me kept waiting for the driver to glance in the mirror and say there had been a mistake, that we needed to turn around, that this wasn't really happening. He didn't. He just drove. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, not because I was afraid anymore, but because I needed something solid to hold on to while my mind caught up with reality. For years, every movement I made required explanation. Every purchase, every outing, every phone call. Now the car was carrying me somewhere no one had approved, and the silence felt enormous. Not empty, free. The difference between those two things is something you only understand after living without the second one for a very long time. The residence Denise ran sat on a quiet residential street lined with older maple trees, the kind of neighborhood where nothing looks dramatic enough to attract attention. If I had passed it 100 times before, I wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. Just another two-story house with a small porch, trimmed hedges, and curtains drawn halfway across the front windows. The taxi stopped at the curb. For a second, I didn't move because stepping out would mean this was no longer temporary. This would mean the new life had officially begun. The driver unloaded my suitcase, nodded politely, and drove away before I could overthink it. I stood there alone on the sidewalk, one hand on the suitcase handle, staring at the front door that represented everything I didn't know yet. New bed, new rules, new people, New future. My pulse thudded once, heavy and real. Then the door opened before I even knocked. Denise was taller than I expected, somewhere in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back and the calm, steady posture of someone who had seen every possible version of this moment before. She didn't ask for explanations. She didn't ask for my story. She just stepped aside and said gently, "You must be Mia. Come in. You're safe here." Safe. That word nearly broke something inside me. The house smelled faintly of laundry soap and brewed tea. Not fancy, not new, but clean, warm, and quiet in a way that felt completely different from the silence I'd left behind. Denise showed me upstairs to a small bedroom with a single bed, a dresser, a reading lamp, and a window facing the backyard where bare branches rested on winter sunlight. "Bathrooms down the hall," she said softly. "Kitchen any time. Dinner's at 6 if you want to join the others. Rest first. No paperwork today. You've already done the hard part." When the door closed behind her, I set the suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time since the taxi pulled away, the reality of what I'd done finally reached all the way through me. My shoulders started shaking before I even realized I was crying. Not from fear, not from regret, from the overwhelming, disorienting sensation of not being watched. No one was about to question why I sat down. No one was about to ask how much something cost. No one was going to check my phone or comment on how long I stayed in the bathroom or whether I really needed another cup of coffee. The absence of control felt almost louder than the control itself had ever been. I don't know how long I sat there like that. Eventually, the shaking stopped. The room stayed quiet. The world didn't collapse. And slowly, a new realization settled in its place. I had actually done it. Late that afternoon, I turned on the prepaid phone for the first time since arriving. Carla had told me there would likely be calls. She was right. Within seconds, the screen filled with missed notifications routed through the forwarding service she'd helped set up for emergencies. My regular phone, the one I'd left behind exactly as planned, had apparently been ringing non-stop since midday. My husband first, then my son, then my husband again, then both of them alternating in frantic repetition. At some point, they had even contacted extended relatives, trying to trace where I'd gone. The messages themselves were almost painfully predictable once Carla read a few aloud over the speaker. "Mia, call me immediately. This isn't funny. Your son is worried sick. You forgot your medication. We need to talk about what's going on." Then later, sharper ones. "You can't just leave like this. This is your home. Whatever someone told you, it's wrong. You need to come back so we can fix this." I listened quietly, surprised by how distant those voices already sounded, like echoes from another building. Carla, calm as ever, simply said, "You don't respond. Not yet. Let the legal notice reach them first. Silence protects you." That evening at dinner, I met two other women staying there. One in her 70s who'd left after her nephew emptied her accounts, another in her 60s who'd quietly sold her house after years of being pressured into signing loans for family members. None of us told our full stories that first night. We didn't have to. There's a certain kind of understanding that exists without explanations, and sitting there at that small kitchen table, passing salt, hearing ordinary conversation about soup recipes and bus schedules, I realized something simple and almost unbelievable. I wasn't the only one this had happened to. The next morning brought the first official step Carla had warned me about, the legal filing. By noon, my husband would be served a notice of separation and a financial petition. By evening, the situation would move from missing wife to documented legal dispute. I expected to feel dread waiting for that moment. Instead, what I felt was an odd, grounded calm. Like the chaos was finally moving into a system bigger than personal arguments or household rules. Courts don't care about who sighs louder at the dinner table. They care about documents, records, ownership, rights. Around 3 that afternoon, the prepaid phone buzzed again. Carla's voice came through steady. "He's been served." Just like that. No explosion, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet sentence marking the exact second my old life officially stopped having legal control over my new one. Outside the bedroom window, a breeze stirred the branches again, sunlight shifting across the yard, the world continuing forward exactly as it always does when someone's entire life changes in the space of a single day. And sitting there on that unfamiliar bed, holding a phone no one could confiscate, breathing air no one monitored, I understood something with a clarity so simple it almost felt like peace. For the first time in years, the future wasn't something I had to ask permission to enter. It was already waiting. The strange thing about knowing the papers had been served was that nothing around me changed, yet somewhere miles away, the entire structure of the life I'd left behind had just cracked down the middle. Denise's house stayed quiet. The kitchen clock still ticked. Someone downstairs ran the kettle. But inside my chest, a long, frozen knot had started loosening in slow, careful turns, the kind that almost hurt because you realize how tight it had been for so many years. Carla had warned me the next few days might feel unpredictable, not because I was in danger, but because control rarely disappears quietly. People who are used to holding power don't suddenly understand they've lost it. First, they deny it, then they argue it, then they try to pull it back. By that evening, the calls began again, only this time they came through official channels instead of desperate voicemails. My husband had hired a lawyer. That alone didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how quickly the story they built sounded exactly like the one I'd heard whispered in my own kitchen for years. According to the first formal message Carla read to me, I was confused. I had been under emotional strain. I had been influenced by outside parties. The petition implied concern for my mental stability, suggested I might not fully understand my financial situation, and even hinted that someone could be manipulating me for money. Sitting there listening to those sentences, I felt something unexpected rise up. Not fear, not even anger, but a kind of steady clarity. Because once something becomes written down, once it leaves the quiet manipulations of a house and steps into the official world, it stops feeling personal and starts feeling provable. Carla didn't react emotionally. She simply nodded once and said, "Good, that means they're predictable." She explained calmly that claims of confusion or instability were common when financial control was involved. It wasn't about truth, it was about the delay, about trying to shake your confidence long enough that you might return voluntarily just to make the stress stop. But documents beat accusations, she said quietly, tapping the folder containing everything I'd gathered. And you did the hardest part already. The next morning, we met with the legal advisor she'd arranged, a woman named Teresa, who spoke in the same calm, practical tone Denise and Carla both seemed to share, as if they understood that panic wastes time and clarity saves it. Teresa went through the financial records slowly, line by line, highlighting pension deposits, joint assets, the sudden account restrictions, the allowance pattern, and the documented expenditures my husband had continued making freely while limiting mine. Seeing it all laid out on paper like that felt surreal. For years, it had been my daily reality. Now, it looked like evidence. He cannot legally deny you access to marital funds, and he certainly cannot restrict your personal pension. We'll file for immediate temporary support and financial disclosure. Once the court orders that, he'll have to show everything. She said it so matter-of-factly that for a moment I just stared at her, because in my old life, nothing had ever sounded that simple. In my old life, every request turned into an argument. Every need turned into a justification. Here, it was just a procedure. That afternoon, the prepaid phone rang again, but this time the number wasn't blocked. It was my son. For several seconds, I just watched the screen vibrate in my hand. Carla, sitting across from me, didn't say yes or no. She only said softly, "If you answer, keep it brief. No explanations, no arguments, just boundaries." I pressed accept before I could change my mind. His voice came through already tight with controlled frustration. "Mom, finally, where are you?" I swallowed once. "I'm safe." "That's not what I asked." "It's the answer you're getting." There was a sharp exhale on the other end. "You've scared everyone half to death. Dad says you left your phone, your things. What is this? Did someone talk you into something? Because if this is about the money, we were helping you. You know that." The words landed exactly the way they always had, wrapped in that calm, reasonable tone that made everything sound like concern instead of control. But sitting there in Carla's quiet office, with legal folders on the table and a door no one could bar from the outside, I heard them differently for the first time. Not as authority, as persuasion. "I'm not discussing this on the phone," I said carefully. "The lawyers will handle everything." "Lawyers?" The word snapped out of him before he could soften it. "Mom, this is insane. You don't need lawyers. You need to come home so we can sort this out like a family." Family. For a moment, years of habit almost pulled me back toward apology, toward explanation, toward smoothing everything over the way I always had. But then I remembered the pharmacy counter, the envelope, the permission for toothpaste, and the words came out steadier than I expected. "I am sorting it out," I said quietly, "just not the way you want." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I could hear faint office noise behind him, paper shifting, someone speaking in the distance. When he finally spoke again, the softness was gone. "You're making a mistake." "No," I said. "I already made that mistake. I stayed." I ended the call before my voice shook. My hands trembled afterwards, but not from doubt, from the strange, overwhelming realization that I had just spoken to my son without asking permission for first time in years. Over the next few weeks, everything moved both slowly and relentlessly forward. Court dates scheduled, financial disclosures demanded, statements filed. My husband's lawyer continued pushing the same narrative: confusion, outside influence, emotional instability, but each claim required proof, and proof kept circling back to the same stubborn facts: the controlled accounts, the allowance, the intercepted communications, the documented spending imbalance. Reality, once recorded, is very difficult to argue away. Meanwhile, life inside Denise's house settled into something almost peaceful. I helped cook some evenings, read in the small sitting room, walked to the nearby park without explaining where I was going or when I'd return. The first time I bought a cup of coffee with my own cash and sat drinking it without checking the time, the simple ordinariness of that moment nearly made me laugh out loud. One afternoon, nearly a month after I'd left, Carla called with an update that changed everything again. "They've agreed to mediation," she said. "That usually means they know the court process isn't going their way." I sat very still, holding the phone, because mediation meant numbers, assets, settlements, legal recognition that my life wasn't something they could quietly manage anymore. Outside the window, a breeze moved through the trees again, the same soft sound I'd heard on the day I arrived, and it struck me how different that sound felt now. Back then, it had meant escape. Now, it meant momentum. For the first time since walking out of that house, I allowed myself to imagine something I hadn't dared picture yet. Not just safety, a future that actually belonged to me. And once that image appeared, calm and solid and entirely possible, I realized something else just as clearly. No matter what arguments they made, no matter how many calls they placed, no matter how long the legal process stretched, I was never going back. By the time the mediation date arrived, the fear that had followed me out of that house months earlier had changed into something steadier, almost quiet. Not confidence exactly, and not relief yet either, but a grounded certainty that whatever happened in that room, I would walk out of it still in control of my own life. That alone felt like a victory no document could measure. The morning of the meeting, Denise drove me downtown because Carla insisted I shouldn't have to arrive alone. The courthouse building rose in pale stone and glass, people moving in and out with folders, briefcases, coffee cups, ordinary reminders that for the world outside my story, this was just another weekday. But for me, it was the day the private reality of my marriage would finally exist in public record. Inside, everything smelled faintly of paper and polished floors. Teresa met us near the elevators with the same calm expression she always carried, the kind that made even complicated legal sentences sound manageable. She reviewed the numbers once more, not dramatically, just carefully, pointing out the pension contributions, the joint savings, the house equity, the documented spending patterns, the allowance structure that looked so small in daily life and now looked so stark when printed beside everything else. "Remember," she said gently, "this isn't about proving you are perfect, it's about proving you had rights, and you do." My husband was already seated in the mediation room when we entered. For a split second, the sight of him in that unfamiliar, neutral space nearly knocked the breath from me. Not because I missed him, and not because I feared him, but because without the house around him, without the routines and the kitchen table and the familiar chair and the television murmuring behind his voice, he looked smaller, older, less certain. My son sat beside him, jaw tight, arms folded, both of them dressed like this was some formal business meeting instead of the unraveling of the life they'd once managed so confidently. Neither of them spoke to me directly at first. Their lawyer did the talking, outlining their position in carefully worded phrases that sounded far more restrained than the messages they'd sent weeks earlier. They expressed concern. They argued over a misunderstanding. They argued that financial management had been intended as support, not restriction. But arguments, Teresa had told me, are only as strong as the evidence behind them, and piece by piece, the documents told their own story. The account transfers, the limited cash access, the pension deposits routed beyond my control, the spending records showing golf fees, electronics purchases, and restaurant bills run alongside my $75 envelopes. The mediator, a quiet woman with silver-framed glasses and a patient voice, asked calm, direct questions, not emotional ones, not dramatic ones, just the kind that require factual answers. And facts, once spoken out loud, have a way of settling heavily in the room. Hours passed that way. Offers moved across the table, numbers adjusted, terms rewritten. I spoke only when necessary, answering clearly, never raising my voice, never apologizing for wanting what was already legally mine. Somewhere in the middle of it, I realized my hands weren't shaking at all. Months earlier, I couldn't buy medication without calculating groceries. Now I was calmly negotiating the division of assets I had helped build over 4 decades. The shift felt almost unreal, yet completely solid. By late afternoon, the agreement finally took shape. Half the retirement accounts, a structured payout for my share of the house equity, full independent control of my pension going forward, transitional spousal support long enough to stabilize housing and medical expenses, legal confirmation that all financial accounts would be disclosed and separated. The mediator slid the final paperwork forward, and for a moment, the entire room went very still, like everyone understood this was the exact second the old arrangement officially stopped existing. When I signed my name, the pen felt surprisingly light in my hand. My husband didn't look at me while he signed his copy. My son did, though, just once. A brief, searching glance like he was trying to reconcile the woman sitting across from him with the version he thought he understood. I didn't look away, but I didn't speak either. There was nothing left to explain that the documents hadn't already said. Outside the courthouse, the air felt sharper, cooler, cleaner somehow. Denise squeezed my shoulder once before heading back to the car, giving me a moment alone on the steps. People continued walking past, conversations drifting, traffic humming, the city completely unaware that for me, an entire chapter had just closed with the quiet scratch of ink on paper. I stood there breathing for a long time, not rushing, not hurrying toward the next thing, just letting the reality settle fully into place. The weeks that followed were filled with practical beginnings. Opening a bank account in my own name again, signing a lease on a small 1-bedroom apartment not far from Denise's house so I could still visit, scheduling my own medical appointments without explanation, buying groceries and choosing whatever brand I felt like without rehearsing a justification in my head. Each action felt almost ridiculously ordinary, yet Each one carried a small, private echo of disbelief. Freedom, it turns out, doesn't arrive as one grand emotional moment. It arrives as dozens of tiny permissions you quietly grant yourself until they start feeling normal. One afternoon, not long after I'd moved into the apartment, Carla called to ask if I might consider volunteering occasionally at the resource center. Only if you want to, she added quickly. Sometimes it helps new clients to talk to someone who's already been through it. I agreed before I could overthink it. The first time I sat in that small office across from another woman twisting a tissue in her hands, whispering that she wasn't sure if what was happening in her home counted as control, I heard my own voice answering her gently, the same words Carla once gave me. You don't have to decide everything today. You only have to keep moving, one step at a time. Saying it out loud, watching her shoulders loosen just slightly, I understood how far I'd actually come. Months later, on a quiet Sunday morning, I stood in my kitchen, sunlight making coffee in absolute silence except for the soft bubbling of the machine. No television fills the air, no one is asking what it costs, no one checked where I planned to go afterward, just the simple sound of my own life unfolding at its own pace. I carried the mug to the window, watched a neighbor walking her dog, and felt something settle inside me so deeply it almost felt like gratitude. Not gratitude for what happened, gratitude for the moment I finally stopped accepting it. Because the truth I learned at 68 wasn't complicated at all. Control survives on silence. Fear survives on routine. But the second you take even one small, documented, deliberate step toward your own independence, the entire structure holding you in place starts to weaken. It doesn't shatter overnight. It doesn't collapse in one dramatic scene. It loosens slowly, piece by piece, until one day you realize the door was never locked as tightly as they wanted you to believe. And standing there in that quiet apartment, holding a cup of coffee I bought with money deposited into an account only I could touch, I finally understood something with complete, unshakable clarity. I hadn't ruined my family. I had saved my life. And for the first time in decades, the future stretching in front of me didn't feel like something I needed permission to enter. It felt like something I was finally free to choose. Before you go, remember this. Somewhere tonight, someone is sitting in a quiet room just like Mia once did, wondering if their life will ever change, wondering if anyone would understand, wondering if it's already too late. If this story proved anything, it's that it is never too late to take one step toward your own freedom. If Mia's journey touched your heart, don't just watch and move on. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and help this story reach the one person who might need it today. And I want you to do something powerful right now. Go down to the comments and type, "I choose my life." You may be writing it for yourself, or you may be writing it for someone silently reading beside you. Either way, your words matter more than you know. Stay safe, stay strong, and remember, the moment you decide you deserve better is the moment your new story begins.